Hello and welcome to Beyond the Donation. I am your host, Matt Bitsagai, and I am excited to be joined by Kat Lacefield today. Kat, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing great. So Kat's with Just Because Consulting. And Kat, maybe you can just take a minute and tell our audience a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your background.
Sure, no problem. So I've been working in the nonprofit sector my entire life, basically since I'm in early high school. We had to do mandatory volunteer work as part of our educational program. And so that led me to work with many different nonprofits in a volunteer capacity, be it in homeless shelters or in elderly folks' homes or with in a Christmas parade at some point. But it really just got me involved in the sector very early on. As soon as I turned 18, I got to work at the Montreal SPCA and work in an animal shelter, which had been my dream. And that kind of started my more official work professional journey into the nonprofit sector. And after many years, as I'm sure anyone listening who's in the nonprofit sector, I fell into fundraising, as tends to be the case. And I've always had a really big passion for it in the sense that it came very easy to me. I loved doing it. I was very comfortable asking for donations. I found it fun, which is very rare. And
Mm-hmm.
so quickly enough, I realized that that was a skill set that could be very useful for a lot of nonprofits, and in particular for the animal rights movement. And so that's how I kind of got more and more involved in the fundraising component. Ended up doing a degree in nonprofit management to learn the actual practical best practices. And then after working in a research lab for the last 6 years on philanthropy and on grant making philanthropy, I had this combined experience of working with individual donations through shelters and through an animal rights group, and then the grant making component, which is a very different ballgame of working with foundations with huge amounts of money that are distributing grants. So that combined experience, plus a lot of my communications experience and everything else I've done in the sector, I started having this expertise that many people were seeking out of having this global holistic perspective on how the sector works in Canada, which is um, it's not um, it's not a lot of people that have that combined experience. And so that led me to start my own practice of consulting, which just because it's the best thing that people need is some fundraising support to really build up their capacity. So that's how I started that's how I started my business. And I find myself here today getting more and more involved in what I've been calling non-human philanthropy. And I don't know if you want us to dive into that straight away, or we can, as you wish.
Yeah, no, I think I would like to kind of go there. So it's not something we've ever really talked about on the podcast before. So when you say non-human philanthropy, why don't you kind of help our listeners understand what you mean by that?
Of course. So a lot of people tend to think, "Oh, what do you mean? Like when animals do philanthropy?" And of course, that's not the case. What I started talking about non-human philanthropy is because when you think about philanthropy, you think, of course, about charities, and that is mostly towards humans. However,
Yep.
there's a growing portion of organizations that are going towards non-human entities, be it animals, or even I can start considering and including the environment, because
Mm-hmm.
protecting biodiversity, protecting an ecosystem, it's not a human entity. It's really something that's external to humans, if you think about it from a superficial level. Of course, as I started diving in, I wanted to start a podcast and write a book on that particular topic. The more and more I started thinking about the fact that at the end of the day, there's nothing that's really non human. Because if we're supporting animals, we're also supporting humans. And let's say the pets have caretakers, they have
Mm-hmm.
pet families, if we could say. So you're also supporting them. And for the environment, that's a very direct connection to be made with humans. Of if there's no environment to support us, that there's no human societies and communities. About non-human philanthropy from the perspective that it is a very different and unique component of the philanthropic space that has its own challenges and limitations. But I wanted to make this idea that we need to really move towards this holistic and more conscious vision of philanthropy that includes everything, as there is no such thing as non-human or human philanthropy. We're part of an ecosystem. Each part plays its role. So I bring it up kind of to push people's buttons and get to
Mm-hmm.
see what's going to come out. But at the end of the day, what I'm pushing for is a more ecosystemic vision of philanthropy, which includes everything.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So when you're working in a cause that maybe isn't directly related to, like, something that we think about a lot, like solving homelessness or
Mm-hmm.
hunger, something that is like directly related to the human component. like, how does your storytelling, how do things change when you're trying to tell that story of that charity, and what are the differences that you would kind of think about there between those types of different organizations?
So for sure, there's a couple things that often need to be said. Is it really depends on the cause itself. So when we're talking about animal organizations, a shelter versus an animal rights group versus an environmental protection or conservation organization, the storytelling will be very different. It also depends on who your audience is. So of course, an example of a shelter, people that most of your audience is going to be people that who have pets. So it's putting the story in so that people can put themselves in the perspective of, imagine if that happened to my pet. I can imagine my animal going through that same kind of situation. So it's the same case as with humans in the sense that people are moved by individual stories.
Mm-hmm.
If you start talking about large issues like poverty and say it's so complex and so large scale that an individual feels like their donation or their impact will be a drop in the ocean and will not change anything. But when you bring an individual story, same as you would for a child in need or a
Yep.
family or whatever it might be from a human perspective, the same storytelling can kind of be said, but of course, about the story of one individual animal. So instead of talking about the millions or thousands of dogs in shelters across the country, you'll talk about one. Pugsley, which is the name of my dog, for example, he just got up, who he was abandoned because his family could no longer take care of him, whatever it is. And you start telling the story of that individual dog. So in that case, it's very, very
Very
similar.
similar. Yeah.
But when we move towards the environment, how do we talk about the importance of protecting a river? If you start calling the river Charlie and saying Charlie, it doesn't have that same
Mm-hmm.
component.
Yep.
So usually what you have to do to connect on the emotional level, which is what donations is often about, it's about connecting to an emotional level, is trying to get people to realize that when they themselves have appreciated a river of like childhood memories, a lot of nostalgia stories can come up about the how we feel when we go out and spend time in nature, that calming sensation of hearing the river flow by. Of I remember as a child sneaking into my grandmother's backyard, and we would climb through the rocks on the little river that went upstream, and that sense of cleansing, both energetically and just the fun of it. So sometimes it's about nostalgia of spending time in nature that can be used. So it's using the human component and the human experience to share why we actually want to protect these environmental and external spaces. So those are kind of the different types of stories that can be shared. However, there's also the other side of humanizing it or individualizing it too much, of being careful not to fall too much into not to anthropomorphize too much
Yep.
a
Mm-hmm.
lot of animal stories. So we have to be aware of not giving them too much human emotion so that it becomes forced or that it feels fake. So
Mm-hmm.
what I often recommend is that to, of course, yes, we can explain the situation without thinking too much of trying to make the human put themselves into the animal's position. That can be a bit of a something that needs to be we need to be wary of and be
Mm-hmm.
careful of doing. And there's also the other challenge of the megafauna. So the issues with
Okay.
storytelling of that humans, we will of course feel more of a connection to any animal that is similar to us. So if we can talk about mammals, it'll be much more connected. When we think about fish, people automatic already like we're so far connected from that animal species that it's harder to connect with them and to put ourselves in that position. If you go down even further to insects or
Mm-hmm.
to less cute animals, if we can say it that way, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just a fact. So it's kind of challenging when we're talking about either an ecosystemic level where we have to protect all of the beings. It's more abstract, but even just certain species that are less attractive. Like, let's protect this scary looking bat. Like, it has an issue. So that's when we'll talk more about the importance from a systemic level of, well, that cute little bat actually is part of an entire system that will help everything. And then you understand the connection. So it's challenging to say what kind of storytelling, because it
Mm-hmm.
really will depend on what the cause is. But I hope that kind of helped explain the different challenges and
Yeah.
opportunities available.
Yeah, and I think it also kind of touches on the similarities. Like, there are some probably fundamental things that, regardless, kind of carry through to good storytelling, and it's
Mm-hmm.
figuring out within those other types of organizations how to make those connections, which it makes a lot of sense. What are some of the other, like unique challenges that you see when working with, and I even hesitate to say non-human, focused organizations just based on the conversation that we're having. Maybe before we go any further, like how do you refer to that without, because as you made the point, a lot of things are connected back to humans. And so like when you refer to these organizations, like how would you kind of refer to them?
I still use the term non-human
Okay.
just to explain like the difference,
Yeah.
or I'll say animal and environment focused
Got it.
organizations just
Okay.
to make the difference. But I find non-human makes sense.
Yep.
But of course, I use it more as like a, what would be the word? Like a, what's the word? When
So
you
like
try
a
to like, yeah,
buzzword type of thing.
buzzword.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
It's a very good hashtag to
Yep.
use, and it
Sure.
hasn't been used before. So it gets people thinking, what do you mean?
Yep.
So it's more of like a challenging word. But
Yeah.
yeah,
That
so
makes
animal
sense.
or environment focused organizations.
So what are some of the other, unique challenges that you see when working with those types or in your own work, in the past in those types of organizations when it comes to, fundraising? I think that's something I'd be really interested in.
Definitely. And the situation is a bit different between Canada and the US. And so I will mention certain things that are very Canadian focused,
Okay.
but there are some that are global, of course. So when we think about the definition of philanthropy itself, so this is a global definition. Philanthropy actually literally means love of man. So phil, love, anthro means humans
Yep.
or man. But when we think about when we're protecting animals and the environment, man is often considered as a separate part of it. We often, when we think about nature, we don't include ourselves in it, which I think is a fallacy that gets ridiculous. Of course, we're part of nature. But when we're talking about the general public and what we perceive of it, when we think about philanthropy, often the straight away we'll think about humans. And so we don't consider the wider container in which humans work. So if we look at the definition itself of philanthropy, that can be a big challenge in fundraising of what grant making, which is the big component of philanthropy, is actually focusing on. And when we look at the historical causes that were funded by philanthropy, I'll give you a little example of the definition in Canada. There's three categories of what is considered charitable. Religion is still one of those top three, education, poverty relief, and then there's and everything else. And in that
Mm-hmm.
everything else category, we have, of course, a wide variety. However, those three main ones are very human focused. And so it challenges, and when we're talking about animals or environment, is it even considered philanthropic to
Mm-hmm.
defend those causes? And in Canada, because of that definition, getting charitable status for those organizations has always been very challenging. So, from a very high level philosophical perspective, we can even ask, is defending animals a philanthropic act? Unless we're thinking about the benefits that it'll bring to humans. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where in Canada, we have the challenge of when registering for a charity, you almost have to prove like what's the benefit for humans, not
Okay.
just for the animals themselves. So, that's a little more specific
Mm-hmm.
situation in Canada. However, there's another one where when you're defending animals and the environment, a lot of time the law is not on your side.
Okay.
There's not as many laws to protect animals and the environment. Of course, we're in the crux of it right now where there
Mm-hmm.
are many movements that are happening and evolving that legislative framework. However, because of that, a lot of these organizations end up being very advocacy oriented. And advocacy is something that is very difficult to prove impact. When you're talking about, let's say, a shelter, that's easy. We
Yep.
saved 300 dogs. When we're saying we spent the last 5 years advocating to change the laws so that gas chamber euthanasia would be illegal in the state, it's like, okay, but what happened? Well, it's almost in parliament. Okay, so you
Mm-hmm.
spent 5 years and we don't even have anything yet. It can take 10 years, 15
Sure.
years to change legislation. And so when you're defending these two big causes, a lot of that education and awareness is hard to measure, which makes it a bit challenging when you're doing fundraising to ask for funds for those more abstract concepts. So in those movements, I think it's a very important factor as well that we need to have those laws in place to be able to then say, well, we're just defending the laws. Like this has
Mm-hmm.
been an accepted social condition that we want as a society. And so we're just helping put that in place. There's actually one of the charitable categories in Canada is defending laws. So a lot of
Okay.
organizations will be like, oh, well, there's an animal cruelty law. We're just defending it. And that's how they're able to get their status.
I see.
However, what do you do if those laws don't exist? You have to become an organization that is
Right.
more lobbying oriented. And then people think that they're crazy animal activists. And so there's, of course, a lot of that, which sometimes they are. But it's not the same approach for fundraising, for advocacy versus more direct causes. So that's
Sure,
number
that
two.
makes sense. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose in some ways, that could probably be said for human-focused organizations that are doing advocacy versus, being as far as like the challenges of sometimes showing the direct impact and so forth. So let's shift and segue to talking just in general about some fundraising topics that I'm very curious to kind of get your thoughts on. One of the things that we are really big believers at donor.com is like building deep donor relationships and really focusing on like retention, because obviously it costs an organization a lot less to retain existing donors than it does to go out and always be trying to find new donors. What are some of the things that, just from your background, you have a deep background in fundraising, you have a deep background working with different types of organizations, like what do you think are some of those like really key steps that nonprofits need to be taking when it comes to like donor retention and retaining donors?
Such a good question. And I think so many organizations fail to get off the acquisition treadmill and just get on the retention cycle. Because, like you said, I've seen a statistic, it was something between like 5 and 20 times
Yep.
like more expensive to get more acquisition than to just retain a donor.
Yep.
I'm gonna answer by starting with a story of the Montreal SPCA had a new sterilization clinic that they wanted to fund. It was a $250,000 project, and it was going to allow for the shelter to offer many more free sterilization clinics, especially for stray cats. And it was going to solve a big problem for the stray cat population in the city. But the project was a pretty hefty bill.
Mm-hmm.
And so what they did is they did a mailing campaign, as they always did, and it pretty much failed. Like, as a mailing campaign, they didn't have a lot of return. They didn't have a lot of success, except for one donor. They got one donation of 200 from a woman. So that's like, in the sense of a global campaign, their return on investment was obviously amazing because of that one donor,
Mm-hmm.
but everything else had failed. And when the person was interviewed, she said she had been giving, and she wasn't even from the city. She was from the other end of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, well, I've been giving for many, many years to this organization. I've been giving about $500 a year, which in that organization was considered a major donor in the sense of
Okay.
retention.
Mm-hmm.
So every year, she said she received a handwritten Christmas card for her donation saying thank you. And in her opinion, an organization that will take the time to write a handwritten letter and say thank you is an organization that pays attention to details, relationships, and what's important. And that's an organization that she will trust to take care of the sterilization clinic and of that major problem that we have of stray cat populations. So that is, if that doesn't tell you the importance and prove to you the importance of building relationships with your donors, even if they are only what we consider a smaller gift of $500, the impact in the long term that can have on the capacity of your donors to give can have tremendous results. So that's just a story that I wanted to share that I feel really expresses the importance of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. You hear those stories probably maybe more often than people realize about how, you've had a donor who's maybe given a small amount and then you don't even realize their capacity. And then, something happens and that becomes very clear. And so much of that is that, I'm a big believer in, thank your donors well, and that will always help your organization. And I think that's a really good example of that. So, one of the things that I always think about, especially like with our customer base, is, this idea of trying to really understand your donors really well, and then do a good job of segmenting those donors out so that when it is time to communicate and engage with donors, whatever that is, if it's thanking them for a donation or simply just, sharing impact stories, whatever it is, that you are doing the best you can to engage with them across like the channels and the channels that they want to hear from you on, and about the topics that they're interested in. And so that really speaks to like donor segmentation.
Mm-hmm.
And, what does that, when I say that, what does donor segmentation mean when we talk about that topic for nonprofits?
Definitely. So people tend to not organize their databases very well. And so when I've done trainings and I give webinars on donor segmentation, specifically for shelters, it's thinking about all the connections that your donors, or shelters or animal organizations, but let's say shelters, that a donor can also be an adopter and a foster family and a board member or a volunteer. You really need to make sure that your list has as much information on this person as possible. I'll share you another personal story that explains the importance of segmentation. Once again, at the Montreal SPCA, I was a volunteer, a foster family. I worked there for 5 years. I received a donation call from a company that they had, I'm assuming, given their list to. Hi, Catherine. Super robotic. And they just go on to explain a story, like a very cheesy story, without saying thank you for working. They don't know who I am at all.
They don't know who you are,
They
right?
don't know who I am. And I was so insulted. Of course, I did not give because I could just give in person. But that just goes to show how many times are people receiving calls and not giving because they feel unseen or unheard.
Sure.
So there's that one component of segmenting to understand and make sure that you're respecting your different donors depending on their level. If they're a monthly giver, you should say it. Thank you for your monthly gift. Thank you for your regular giving. It allows us to have stability versus that one-time donor that gave 2 years ago. You have to recognize the different journeys that these people have been on. Another really important point about segmentation is understanding the capacity of an organization to do stewardship for absolutely everyone. The handwritten card thing. You cannot send a handwritten card to all of your donors if you have thousands of donors on your list. I mean, you can, but it'll cost you a pretty penny and it'll take a lot of time. So you have to learn how to focus and prioritize your list. I focus on 3 major categories for just that prioritization usually. And it's based on, of course, the amount of the donation that has to come into consideration, but not just the last gift, for example. You can also consider the average, because sometimes people go through different times, different periods.
Yep.
Having the average can help you understand their overall or average capacity, of course, to give, which over time can be quite significant instead of looking at just the last one. Of course, there's also the lifetime value. Yep. Someone who has been giving $60 every month for 10 years or more, that's a very significant amount at the end of the day. So there's the amount that has to be considered, but make sure to understand the other different segments within the amount. The second is, of course, the frequency of donations. So someone who has given once in their whole lifetime is not the same as someone who has given 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So prioritizing based on that of maybe a one-time giver will have a 1-point prioritization versus someone who has given over 5 times will have 3 points, for example. So that's another segment that needs to be considered. And then there's the last one that I usually include in my analyses of databases, which is recency. How warm is your contact? Did they give you a big donation, but 5 years ago? Are they even maybe still living in that same city? Do you even still have their updated contact information? Have they changed? Have they had children? We don't know. So when it's been a longer time, before asking, you need to do some form of warm up. Send some emails and see, are they still even reading our emails? So you can segment your donors to that category and create these automated filters where, okay, we'll send them a warm up email, maybe give them some news or get them to click on something. And those who interact will get created into a second segment, which will be active, like new,
engaged,
engaged. Yeah, that's a good one. Engaged older donors. And then you can start bringing them towards the ask. So these 3 factors of amount, frequency, and recency are very important when segmenting your database to understand how you're going to approach these different people. So making sure who are you going to send that handwritten card? Who are you going to call to say thank you? But also to be able to warm them up if need be, depending on where they are on that spectrum.
Yeah, agree with you 100%. And I think, obviously it would be great if we could do meaningful one-to-one engagement with every donor every single time. We know that's not always possible. And so I think the other thing that, good segmentation does is help you identify, as you said, like who do we want to engage one-to-one with versus who are the candidates where we want to engage, but it's going to have to be on a more of like a one-to-many type of a setup or a situation. And I suppose, those are giving specific things. There's all sorts of, you touched on a couple other things in your story or your example, understanding how people volunteer for your organization, or what other ways that they've engaged with you in the past can also be really good segments that can help you in building, in my mind, building better relationships and just a more of a connection to your donors. So
Exactly. It's about getting to know them. When I was doing donor development, donor management for an animal rights organization, and we didn't have thousands and thousands. We had maybe 2,000 monthly donors and
mm-hmm.
maybe a list of 4,000 like one-time giving. I was alone in my department, but with my list, I was almost able to call everyone at least once throughout my year, because
Yep.
if they didn't answer, of course I didn't necessarily harass them until
Right.
they answered, but I was able to send them just a quick call, ask them if is your information up to date, did we take all the information correct, because this was face-to-face donations on the street, and
Mm-hmm.
just ask them like, thank you so much, like what motivated you to give. And of course, when their credit card expired, I would talk to them one-on-one.
Yep.
So sometimes having someone on the other line really allows you to build a connection. And I would include notes so that if I ended up calling them 6 months later, I'm like, hey, how's Fido the dog? How's your
Yep.
cat?
Yep.
Did she, like, how's her cancer? Did she end up making it through? Making that effort to make a personal connection with your donors, it goes a long way.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to bring up one more point about the one to many versus the difficulty in establishing direct relationships with everybody. I think there are some ways, and I know that DonorDoc has a great like AI system that allows for retention to be a lot easier to identify the prospects. But there's another component that's interesting, is that allowing donors to share their stories with you, so that it's more
Mm.
of a them taking the action that can be automated. I'm a partner of this amazing platform called ProofPact, which
Okay.
allows you
Yep. We're
to, when
familiar.
I love them. So when you make a donation, for example, if there's some form of prompt, it can even just be as simple as like hit reply and share us your story, which if you want to go simple. But what's cool about this kind of platform, and I'm not sure if DonorDoc has this kind of, and feel free, I'd love to know if it does, to collect stories either in the form of a video or sending pictures or a chat that you can then use as a story collection to showcase their stories publicly, if they consent, of course. Because that way, even someone who gives $20, if they share you a video of them saying, I donated to your organization because I spent my entire childhood in the wilderness and I find it sad that my children might not have access to that in 5-10 years because of urbanization. Like, that can be a powerful message that you can then use to share. So you can reply to them, say, thank you so much for sharing this video. So it creates a relationship right off the bat of when they make a donation that is not necessarily coming from you. They're
Mm-hmm.
almost stewarding themselves by sharing their own story. It makes them experience the experience much more memorable and allows them to feel much more connected because they feel listened to. That you're not just saying, thank you for the money, bye. You're actually
Yep.
asking for their story of who they are as individuals. So that's another
Yep.
tactic that I think it could be really useful.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, we've had Dave on the podcast from Proof Pact and have it on our roadmap to actually be building an integration to that with our giving pages. So very big fan of what he's doing over there and what their team's doing. As we, a couple thoughts, you mentioned back, and I think I want to go back to it because I actually think it's something that people miss quite often. This idea that, I have 1,000 donors I'm responsible for the relationship for. There's absolutely no way I can engage with all those people. We have a really cool thing in DonorDoc called the Daily Five that basically just takes 5 of your donors that you're responsible for the relationship for and pops them up on what we call the action board every day, encouraging you to engage with them. And we've seen it work for people where they get through those 5 every day. It's a simple, I maybe send a text message or a quick email or just pick up the phone and make a phone call to them. But that when you break it down into that small manageable chunk, all of a sudden you've gotten a lot more done, 6 months in than what you realized you could. And I think that's a really valuable lesson that you kind of touched on there, is like you break it down and you stay consistent and you're going to be able to accomplish a lot when it comes to building those relationships. So I think that's great.
It's kind of like any behavior that we try to change in life. If you want to lose 200 pounds, like it
Hmm.
sounds insane. But if you're like, oh, well, let's start with losing 5,
Yep.
and then you build it up, and then that's how you will achieve big results. And like you said, it's consistency. So establishing that and carving out the time so that it's part of your schedule, even if it's just like, okay, if your job is donor retention, like I hope you're actually doing that, but let's say if
Hmm.
it's donor management generally, take half an hour every day to
Yep.
send an email to one of your top prospects, or to send them a DM if ever you happen to have them on social media. If someone, a donor, says, thank you, I just donated, why don't you just send them a message on social media to say thank you? That's
Yep.
personal. People will
Yep.
read that. Text messages, people like,
They open
the
them.
rate is,
Yeah.
they
Is
open them all. You receive a
Yep.
message, you will open it.
Yep.
Like
That's right.
95% of the chance. So I completely agree. I think having, and that's one of the things that I wish more CRMs did. I mean, for you, it's great that I don't know many other organizations and companies that do that, but I feel like it needs to be integrated. And we have the power of AI on our side to be able to automatically focus on who the priorities are of, hey, this person hasn't been mobilized in 2 years. Why don't you send
Yep.
them a personal email? That we have that power on our side, and we really need to mobilize it as a nonprofit sector.
100%. Couldn't agree more. Kat, as we're kind of wrapping up here, you obviously you have a very deep background in the nonprofit space. You've have an impressive resume of things that you've done. If you could just offer like one piece of advice to, executive directors or development directors that are out there working in these nonprofit organizations, like what's that piece of advice or that tip that you would want to share with them?
Invest in your fundraising or your development strategy. Most people are just throwing themselves like, oh, they're running from like one thing to the next. Take the time to invest in yourself to have a plan. If you want to build a house, you need to have a plan, or else your house will not stand. And so we need to have that for fundraising. And that investment will have a huge return on investment. That's what people don't realize. You need to spend a bit of money to make more money down the line. If you're organized, kind of like that, identifying those 5 prospects per day.
Mm-hmm.
If you just have a list of 1,000, you don't know where to start, you're not going to start.
Yep.
But if you have a plan of, this is the 5 people you're going to talk to today, tomorrow, et cetera, you'll be able to move forward. And that's why I think investing in a donor database analysis and segmentation
Yep.
eases everyone's world. Investing in a donor pipeline or prospecting list to know who to approach, investing in a grant pipeline, or investing in just someone that's going to sit down with you and create a plan of which approaches should you do. Should you do mailing? Should you do peer-to-peer? Should you do email? You can't do everything. So focus on what are your strengths, and usually having someone to help you, even if it's internally, to just that's dedicated to making that plan with you, it really goes a long way in getting clarity and getting those donations in.
Very sage advice, and I appreciate that. I'm sure our listeners will as well. Kat, tell our listeners how they can find out more about you and more about the services that you provide and what you do.
Definitely. So I'm a big LinkedIn fan. I
Okay.
absolutely loved it. So you can definitely find me on LinkedIn, Catherine Lacefield, with McDonald on parentheses. I'm changing my name at the moment. If not, I'm also in the middle of launching my podcast, which is going to be called the Just Because podcast. So please follow me on LinkedIn to get more news about that. If not, you can also check me out at justbecause.consulting. It's my website.
Wonderful. And we will make sure to link all of those things in the show notes so that our listeners can find you. Kat, this has been a pleasure to have you on Beyond the Donation. Thank you for sharing your insight, your expertise, and your knowledge with our listeners. I'd love to have you back on in the future, and good luck with your own podcast that you're kicking off here. So,
Thank you so much. It was really nice talking about all this with you.
absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Beyond the Donation. If you liked this episode, please go out and like and follow us on your podcast platform of choice. And we look forward to talking with you next time.